This really is a historical event. The two governments had not been speaking for 20 years.
It's been dubbed a frontier of peace and friendship. Ethiopia and Eritrea reopen key border crossings for the first time in 20 years.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmad wraps up an historic state visit to Asmara. Working out the details may still be demanding.
Why has it been so difficult to have civil discussions about politics in the diaspora community?
We're talking death, war, freedom, human rights violations, topics that are really difficult to talk about regardless of anything to consider. Then you add a lack of respect for the person who shares a view other than your own, the other side. And then I think intention plays a big role in it too. When you're having these conversations, when we're having these conversations, these political discussions, are we going into the conversation to learn from each other, to understand each other's perspectives, to gain a better understanding of the situation, or are we going in these conversations to debate and to say that we're right and you're wrong, or whatever the case might be? So I think a mixture of all of those things, the fact that it's extremely sensitive topics, that layer of respect, especially when we're talking about online conversations, which is like where I feel like a lot of the diaspora community has their political discussions, and then these intentions behind these conversations, I think that makes for very negative and unhealthy conversations, you know?
And I guess I would also say that it depends on which group you're talking about, right? Because when it's Eritreans amongst Eritreans, I think that, like you said, there is a lot of pain and there's a lot of loss. It's very real and it's very recent. So people have literally lost like siblings, parents, children. And so when you're at different ends of, when your political views don't match, there's like this dissonance where they can't see eye to eye because they're like, well, we lost. So it's like emotionally triggered. But then I think also something that comes up when it's like Ethiopian versus Eritrean conversations, sometimes I hear a lot of like, oh, we're the same anyways. And that feels dismissive. And so, I don't know, sometimes I think that that's something that also isn't really discussed, where it's sort of like that history is so complex and so sensitive that you can't just say we're the same and brush it off, because that's the very reason why we fought in this war, is so that we could like be liberated. So when you just brush it back and you're just like, oh, it's the same, I think that that's something that I've seen as a very big trigger.
Yeah, and I remember for myself, the first time I ever had a discussion with someone about the Ethiopian and Eritrean conversation, I realized after it that I was someone that was acting like that. And I, like now, a couple of years later, I realized it was very ignorant of me. But at the same time, what I also left with was that both sides have generations of political agendas coming from the people older than us and more mature than us, whether it be parents, mentors, people as it is from back home. And as diaspora, we don't just get up and Google. We don't just get up and research. So we listen to the people that we respect. And they tell us their political ideologies, and 9 times out of 10, we run with it. So when we have our first or second conversation with someone from another side, all we know is what we know. So we don't allow ourselves to open up to the possibility of what I've been knowing for these past couple of decades to be wrong or to be incorrect or misleading. And once we acknowledge that, then we can move forward and have conversations like these where we discuss the reality of both our situations.
Right. I will say, like, my knowledge is limited when it comes to like Ethiopians discussing things with each other. I'm sure there's opposing views in Ethiopia, but my knowledge is kind of limited when it comes to that. But I do know what it's like when Eritreans from different opposing views discuss things with each other, and then Eritreans and Ethiopians discussing things with each other. And like, there's just a pattern that I see a lot. So I'm gonna start off with the Ethiopians. With the Ethiopians, I find like a lot of times when they talk to us, it's like, I'll say this. I think a lot of times with Ethiopian people, I'll say that they suffer from is like a superpower mentality, because Ethiopia is a superpower nation in East Africa, right? So what happens a lot of times is that like they talk to Eritreans like in a way where like everything is just revolving around them. You know, whatever you got going on, it's like they're gonna go relate it to them somehow. Yeah. And that's what I see a lot, right? And that's not always the case. So it's like they kind of gotta understand that like, you know, we have things that have gone on in our country, and we have our own history, and we have our own things that's going on, and like they kind of gotta. I feel like they kind of gotta get out of that mentality. Otherwise, it's always just gonna be like we're gonna be defensive, and they're just gonna be like saying what they're saying. With Eritrea, we have the opposition of the government, and then we have the supporters of the government. So I'll start off with the opposition. The opposition in Eritrea, a lot of times, like, you know, like they may have the right intentions, maybe they've gone through things, maybe they could think what they want, but I think a lot of times they're very emotional when they're talking about these things, and in the sense that like they will entertain anything that will basically paint the government in a bad light, and it could be anything. So basically, as long as it's something bad, they're cool with it, you know. And if you say anything that's kind of like against what they're saying, they may get very like angry and be like, oh, what, you're just a supporter, you're Shabia, you're this, you know. How do we like do things and like create solutions to what's going on right now instead of just bickering and talk and being like negative about everything. As far as the supporters, I find that like the supporters a lot of times, I'm not gonna say that they don't care about the people. They definitely do care about the people. I know for a fact they care about the people. But a lot of times I find when they're talking, they're prioritizing the government over the people. You know what I mean? When they're talking, it's like, okay, yeah, you want to make sure like, okay, you're showing sympathy towards the government, but you also got to show, I feel like they need to start showing empathy towards the people.
Why don't the governments engage in civil discussions? Why don't the political groups engage in civil organizations? Why don't the people, especially in diaspora, engage in civil discussions? That's how I see it. So we can treat it at individual level, micro level. We can look at it at meso level, group level, political organizations, civic organizations, this and that. And we can also see this or view it at macro level, at region level. So to start with, at individual level, if we're going to have a healthy country, a healthy Eritrean nation, each of us have obligation towards the other co-national. We keep missing this issue. Our political beliefs in general are infested with binary categories. Binary categories in the sense ELF, TPLF, lowland, highland, Muslim, Christian, woman, man, and what have you. So these binary categories create a loss of judgment. I don't see you as a person, you know, as a citizen. I see you belong to some group. So I shut off, my mind is shut off from it, from this group, from that group, from that group. So we're not practicing national politics.
Ethiopia's strength lies in its military power. Heavily backed by Russian aircraft and artillery, Ethiopia's 350,000-man army is the largest military force in Africa. The major governing force in Eritrea is the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, otherwise known as the EPLF. In Tigray, the governing force is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. The EPLF and the TPLF now control 80 to 90% of the territory, with the Eritreans functioning as a fully armed military force. Although the two movements are often lumped together, the stated goals of each are radically different. In 1952, the United Nations joined Eritrea, a former Italian colony, with Ethiopia. 10 years later, in violation of international law, Emperor Selassie forcibly annexed Eritrea. Made up of 9 different ethnic groups, Eritrea struggles for total independence from Ethiopia. The Tigrayan conflict stems from a desire for equality within a multinational state. The TPLF does not want an independent Tigrayan nation, however, recognizing that the Tigrayans are Ethiopians. The TPLF wants to promote unity within equality for all of Ethiopia's people.
We have to remind viewers here that there were two bloody wars in their history. First of all, the independence struggle between 61 and 91. Eritrea was an Ethiopian province, the only one to have been colonized by Italy for 50 years. That gave them the sentiment of being a bit different and pushed them into this independence struggle. In 93, they officially become independent, and Ethiopia loses all access to the sea. And then, of course, in 98, another two-year border war, very bloody. 80,000 people are killed.
A terrible war, needless war. And it's a war that has all kinds of hidden agendas. It really isn't a war that is what it purports to be. It's a war about Ethiopian expansionism.
We might be more concerned about pride, integrity, respect, and all that kind of thing, trust, confidence. When you lose that, it becomes a big problem for us in this region. It's not always money and resources.
It's true that we have had disagreements on the border issue. We have had disagreements on trade and related issues. But you don't go invading a country with whom you have dispute on trade issues. We have more civilized mechanisms of resolving such problems.
Everybody wants to defend his country. Since our countries demand so many things, that's one of the things that we want to fight and to defend our country. That's our willingness.
This is our tradition since the 17th or the 16th or as far as the 13th century. Whenever we get an aggression from outside, we Ethiopians are always united to defend ourselves.
I'm not only sorry for my fellow Eritreans, I'm sorry for Ethiopians as well. It wasn't necessary.
At the end of the day, like, the people suffered economically. Both countries suffered, and it was over just a little piece of land that had no like importance in it. You know what I mean? It was just, it was very. I think it was very knuckleheaded for both of the governments to be doing that.
I think it's important to look at what happened between 91 and 98 and understand the agreements that were made and how that had an impact on both economies. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think a war happens because of a land that doesn't really have much value, like you said. Right. What's understood, at least, is that Eritrea gained from the economic privileges that were given to them or were arranged with the TPLF regime, with the Ethiopian government at that time, including use of the birr, including tariff-free trade, including a number of things.
Like, Eritreans definitely did benefit from doing business with Ethiopia, and but the Ethiopians also benefited from doing business with Eritrea because they had access to the ports, right? But the thing is, what happened is Eritrea also kind of instigated certain things in the 90s, before the war. When we had the same currency as Ethiopia, the Eritrean government decided to change the currency. It was a birr, you called it. They changed it to natfa after, right? And that really angered the Ethiopian government. They did not like that. That is one of the key elements that started the war.
The second day of the London talk saw confident rebel delegates arriving, already conscious that their forces were in control of the Ethiopian capital. All parties agreed that the EPRDF would set up a transitional government to prepare for free democratic elections. However, another of the rebel groups introduced a rider to the proceedings. The Eritrean delegates announced they intended to establish their own independent government.
To guarantee the national security of Eritrea and safeguard the hard-won achievements of the Eritrean people.
You know, from researching this topic and trying to understand what happened that led to this, because from 91 to 98, there was basically a common market, right? Economic freedom between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Again, like you were saying before, they had shared history, right? The TPLF and EPLF were in the armed struggle against the Ethiopian army before that. But it was that notion, that narrative that people were discussing, that during that time, Eritrea was benefiting from the agriculture and the resources of Ethiopia. In 97, the TPLF regime decided to relook at these agreements to see how Ethiopia can benefit more, or whomever in Ethiopia can benefit more. Like, the interests, I think, changed. I think that Eritrea was benefiting because they supported TPLF and the TPLF regime, and the TPLF needed that support because the TPLF were a minority at the end of the day within Ethiopia.
Absolutely.
And so in order to control a country that large
100%.
as a minority, you need military and political power and support. And Eritrea, I think, provided that in exchange for economic policies that may have been illegal or legal that benefited the Eritrean regime, and not as much the Ethiopian, the actual nation. Maybe the TPLF regime, but not the nation. And then in '97, when those agreements they wanted to relook it, I think that's too much of a coincidence for that to have happened. And then within months, shots are fired, and a whole full-fledged war is occurring between two people who had just, for like 7 years, were using the same currency, common like open trade or whatever it might be, you know, and we're experiencing these privileges that a lot of other nations can't have. So I think that coincides.
Makes sense.
The way it started was more like what do you call not a real cause but ostensible cause. Like 12 people were killed, 12 what do you call soldiers. This is a police case, this is not a war case. One could argue by any means the Wayanes or the Addis Ababa regime was trying to attack Ethiopia, what you call Eritrea, by any means. But their problem was not really bad men. Their problem was in the economic issues, in their relationship issues. Had the relationship issues been conducted properly, in a standard way, in an institutional manner, it could have been avoided. But the problem was the relationship was personal between Meles and between the two leaders. Nobody knew what was going on.
So do you think that it impacted the Eritreans worse than the Ethiopians?
Of course. The Ethiopians, what did they lose? They lose maybe 250,000 army. They can afford it. For them, it's expendable. They went to Djibouti for the last 20 years, 30 years to get. They lost billions and billions. But still, we're only 3 million or 5 million or 4 million. There are 100 million people. So always war damages the weaker more than the stronger.
Do you think it benefited the Ethiopian government?
It benefited who?
Do you think the war benefited
No,
Ethiopia?
nobody, no country benefited from this war.
Okay.
No country benefited from this war.
So
Because you see, to bring from Massawa to feed the northern Ethiopia is about, what, 300 kilometers, 200 kilometers? But to bring an item from Djibouti, the price goes 3 times, 4 times. They did this just to undermine the Eritrean independence. So it was really, could I call it identity issue? You can name it anyway, whatever it is, it did not benefit Ethiopia, it did not benefit Eritrea. And much more, Eritrea was damaged by this war.
It's a war neither Eritrea nor Ethiopia can afford. Both are poor and underdeveloped. Ethiopia faces massive famine, while Eritrea still has to rebuild so much that was destroyed during its war of liberation. Yet inexplicably, the crazy war continues.
I feel like what we're not talking about is that agreement that was signed, right? Because Badime was appointed to Eri, right? And so it was appointed to Eritrea, but Ethiopia didn't want to listen, right?
Abide by it.
Yeah, it didn't want to abide. It wanted to renegotiate those terms. And I think that like military stalemate is what propelled Eritrea into 2 decades of like economic chaos. And like the conscription, you can argue, came about because of that, right? Because now you need to have all this military at this border because this is Eritrean land, but it's being occupied. It's also a power play, right? Because if the UN is there, like if they're saying, yeah, we do recognize this paper was signed and this is Eritrea's land, but you're not removing your troops and we're not going to do anything about it. Like, I think that there's so much that I have more questions than answers about that, because it's like, if this is something that was agreed upon and then it was taken back, why is no one addressing the fact that, like, look at this thing has, I think, shaped the history for what we've been experiencing in Eritrea.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's say that was the case, right?
Yeah.
Let's say that was the case. Obviously, your reaction is to fight, right? It's for war.
Okay.
Let's say after 30 days,
Okay.
you can at least send diplomats to each other's country and start talking.
Yeah. Don't you think that it's way past the point of that probably by the time it got to that point?
But not to the point where
For
you.
who though, bro?
Yeah, exactly. For who? For
we
two
talking
people.
about?
Yeah, we're not talking about two
Are
nations.
we talking about the governments? I could care less what these people in the power are mad about or whatever, because at the end of the day, like, it's the people that are suffering. So it's like, that's why you have to have diplomatic talks, because it's just not beneficial
Okay.
at the end of the day.
Is Badame Eritrean soil?
Of course.
Was it invaded?
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I know, yes.
So the country decides to go to war to defend its border. Is that not the right move?
Of course.
Is that not the logical
No,
move?
but you're. I feel like you're sticking to the point that it was the border. But based off what Hanah was saying, and I also believe what she's saying, that the fact is it wasn't the border. They just chose the border as a definite reason to the entire international community.
Who chose the border?
No, that was outlined apparently.
No.
chose the border?
What I mean is choose the border to start the conflict. I'm not talking about the border.
So who started the conflict?
I don't know who initiated the shooting. I personally don't know.
Yeah.
That's very like
That's,
up in the air.
You know what I'm saying? Like
there's no concrete.
I don't know
there's
who
nothing
sent the
concrete
shots,
on
but what
that.
I'm just asking questions.
No, it's
Yeah,
fair.
yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
And I think
I'm
it's
just asking questions.
No, it's
but they're
cool.
good
It's cool.
questions because I think that's the thing. That's why a lot of people are so like arguing this, because it's like
No, let's say the Ethiopians shot first. Let's just say it, whatever, and we shoot back, and the thing goes on for like 2 weeks. Still gotta do diplomatic talks. It's not worth it, fam.
My own soil, bro. That's what I'm wondering.
It's just not worth. Like, what happened?
But
we didn't
listen,
gain
yeah,
much.
But economics is not.
Yeah, you don't think that when you're defending.
Thinking right now, when you're being invaded.
Yeah.
You're not thinking.
You're not
about
thinking, oh, the
stuff like
finances of this are
yeah.
gonna be pretty tricky.
Yeah.
Like you're
Well, I think-
and your and it's not one person,
know
right?
what-
It's
you
a
know
whole
what they always
military.
On a large scale, you
Okay,
do
but-
think
but-
like
but-
that.
No. Whenever
My
you
question
read,
is, why didn't it go further? Then, if it was a real if it was actually about invading Eritrea, like I said, what was the value of Badame? What was this value?
Yeah,
Like,
then
if
that's
it's a
what
real
they-
invasion,
that's
why wouldn't
what
it go to
always-
Asseb? Why wouldn't they have invaded Asseb?
bro, there's no.
Asseb was
It doesn't matter though.
Bro,
It doesn't matter if the
bro,
Asseb
there's
or
no
Badame.
resources like Badame. There's nothing there.
It doesn't matter.
But no, but it does matter because that is what it's always. People always talk about
That's why
that.
they targeted that.
People always, the Eritrean people,
No,
Ethiopian
but so
people,
it's
everyone always
awkward.
talks about
You
how.
never heard.
But
Yo.
The saying you give somebody an inch, they want a mile.
Alright,
Where does
but-
that come from? It means it's something that's small and irrelevant. That's just you're opening up the floodgates for something bigger potentially, right?
I personally feel like you're still sticking on the fact that it was a dispute over land invasion.
Over Eritrean soil.
Yes, but
But
what
what's
we're
the
saying,
value
what we're
of it?
saying
I don't
that
think
land
that's what it
that
was.
land has no economic value to either nation, right?
But
so
it's
then you
still,
take
who are you to tell somebody that
You're-
your front lawn
exactly.
is useless? So whether or not I'm on it, it doesn't
No, no,
matter.
no.
This is
No, for
useless.
sure. But it's the
We're so deep in the weeds that step back. It doesn't matter whether or not it was not just, right? Regardless, after all that economic loss, after all that human loss, after everything, Ethiopia still did not move their soldiers from the front line.
Absolutely, yeah.
So,
Eritrean soil.
and it's Eritrean
no,
soil.
absolutely,
Do we
no.
not
And-
have a right to defend ourselves?
100%.
Is that
100%, definitely. We had a right to defend ourselves as soon as they came in and whatever. They did that. But I will just say that, if the Ethiopians weren't willing to talk about that, then that's on them. That's on them. I am going to put some blame on them. But I will, me being the guy I am, is that I will say that these people need to, it takes two, right? These people need to come together and talk, right? It does take two. So,
that for sure.
and that's all I'm saying. And I don't want to be the guy to just be, oh yeah, dumb. It's like, no, y'all both need to start talking to each other, negotiating and doing whatever.
Diplomatically.
Yeah.
Top story now. The United Nations Security Council has unanimously voted to lift sanctions. That includes a travel ban, an asset freeze and an arms embargo on Eritrea. These measures have been in place for nearly a decade, but Eritrea has significantly improved relations with both Ethiopia and Djibouti in recent months.
The agreement to lift sanctions on Eritrea recognises the improvements in regional peace and security and the positive steps Eritrea has taken to meet the demands of the Security Council. And it is right that in the light of such developments, we reconsider the measures.
from my perspective, I feel like whether the sanctions were there or not, domestically there were sanctions on the Eritrean people, from what I believe, from policies that the regime instated, right? Just to name a few, just as the UN said that no import or exports could be leaving or entering Eritrea, since 2003, Eritrea imposed their own. Construction was also outlawed since 2006. So these are domestic sanctions that hurt the, I don't want to say hurt the people, but affect the nation just as much as the United Nations sanctions would. So when it was lifted, at first glance, I was surprised and I was like, okay, this is a big move. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realized that the country was not fazed or affected by it. Internally, from what I think. And from what I see, the beneficiaries was the regime itself, because to the international community, they became more as a potential ally or partner.
Eritrea?
Yeah.
Because of the sanctions?
Because the sanctions were being lifted. Since it was lifted. Now it's, you can have a seat. And at the UN...
But it's only been like 2 weeks. No, it's not been 2 weeks.
A couple months.
It's been a couple
Right.
months.
But my whole point is, I don't think domestically anything has changed due to the sanctions.
I think I don't agree at all. I feel like the sanctions were not justified. They were alleged. There were allegations that Eritrea was supporting the Islamist group.
Al-Shabaab.
Yeah. And there was no actual proof. And that those sanctions had Eritrea in a stranglehold. So how can this country thrive economically? How can this country even survive? So no, I don't think it was justified.
I don't agree with the whole sanction policy thing. But as far as you saying it didn't do it, no, it does affect things because we weren't allowed to trade with so many countries. You know what I mean? And now we're allowed to do that. So Eritrea was able to maneuver around it, you know, but it does affect the country no matter what. And I can say that for other countries, Zimbabwe or other countries that have been sanctioned, Cuba, for how long they've been sanctioned. It affects the country for sure because it isolates them from the rest of the world.
I think what he's trying to say is how much of an effect did it really have if there were already restrictions prior to 2009?
But I think it's always going to be different. Self-imposed restrictions are going to be different than something that's
understandable.
You know,
For sure.
internationally.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yes and no. Okay, I'll say no. I'll start off with no because you know the North Korea term for Eritrea I don't like. I think it was an exaggeration in order to just insult the country. You know, I've been to Eritrea recently. It's not like North Korea. You know what I mean? It's nothing like North Korea. There's access to internet, even though it's limited. There's still access to internet. Tourists come in there from all over Europe and whatnot. They're allowed to use their cameras in there. I use my camera in there. You see my camera? It's a big camera. I use it in front of police, whatnot. No issues. You can't film in front of the military and in the government buildings, but you can film anywhere else in the country. It's fine. In North Korea, you can't do that. The thing is, you know, North Korea, they have their thing. Eritrea has their thing. There's no need to just call it what it is, you know? I will say that, it was also accurate, though, in a way, as far as the hardline government policies in the country and the militarization of the country. Yes, I feel like it was accurate in that sense.
Just I've seen many, YouTube videos of foreigners who come to Eritrea and they're just like, wow, it's so beautiful. Yeah. The people are so beautiful. Absolutely. You know, it's free. It's not what I thought it would be. And that's people's perceptions that have been formed and shaped as per the media, like you've said. But beyond that, a lot of the things that we've talked about are true, human rights. Not to say that any country in the world, any other country, including Ethiopia, hasn't done them, but human rights violations, youth being in SOA for longer than it was supposed to be, than it was said in the Constitution.
The conscription.
The conscription.
Yeah.
Like you said, newspapers, free speech, opposition members of EPLF who, didn't agree with the regime and what happened eventually, you know what I mean? Yeah. Where are they now, where a lot of these people, religion, certain people practicing certain religions and prisoners and all of that stuff. And then, of course, the influx of Eritrean refugees, you know, of course also other parts of the world, including Ethiopia, Somalia, etc. But all of those things are true. It's not a matter of, did these people die, were they imprisoned, did they have to flee, did they have access to this or that, you know? It's true. It's just I think the way, like you're saying, the way that it was focused on Eritrea more than, for example, Ethiopia, like a lot of times I feel like the conversation was, in my opinion, I feel like everyone was talking about Ethiopia's experiences like economic growth, but they're not talking about the issues within Ethiopia, like the civil unrest or whatever might be, the, you know, the lack of freedom of speech and all those characteristics or issues, violations that were happening in Eritrea. They weren't really talking about it in Ethiopia so much. I think that it was talked about, like you said, more in Eritrea, or put on as like Eritrea's equates to that, and that alone. There's nothing else that Eritrea can equate to.
But the government tells another story.
Eritrea is now one of the very few African countries that will be able to meet many of the Millennium Development Goals.
And it's true. The healthcare system has improved massively. Far fewer babies and children die than at independence. HIV and malaria rates have rapidly been reduced. Literacy rates have also improved. Yet still they flee.
I think when we ask, like, could the government or could Eritrea have done anything differently? I'm curious to know how the public opinion would change if we had more, like, a variety of media outlets, and if we had, I don't know, if we had more access to knowledge of like what's actually happening there, because we in the diaspora are so left in the dark and very much to the things that our families are telling us. We're sort of left with, it depends, right? Like within one family you'll have so many different opinions that you're like, I don't know how to formulate any kind of understanding of what's going on. But then I don't know, I think there's a lot of things that Eritrea has done well that doesn't get talked about, because people are so quick to believe the negative things. People are so willing to want to focus, like you said, on all the things that we're not doing well or our shortcomings, that they don't think about how, like, Eritrea was one of the countries that achieved like most of the MDG goals. A lot of the youth in Eritrea are educated, actually. Like there's a lot of things that there's being done for like environmental preservation. Plastic bags aren't allowed. Like just small things where I'm like, whoa, there's so many positive things that the government is doing to try and like, there's a vision, you know, totally, but we don't get to see that. We're not privy to that because
and people don't want to talk about that. People only want to talk about negative things, but they are doing some good things. The negative things, like, you know, they're just gonna blow up, and maybe those are issues that we need to talk about. But you should talk about the good things too, and I try to do that. But when I do that, like, you get put in a certain box if you do either or.
And that's,
you know?
where that conversation between like these political discussions within the diaspora, that's where the problem lies. It's like you can only talk about one or the other. You can't.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Because of course there are positive things. But then you can't just only talk about the positive things. Like you need to talk about, like, it's a reality, like, you know, everywhere, whatever that might be. So I think that's a huge problem in how we have these conversations, that we can't merge the two and try to understand, okay, great, we've done good in that, let's continue. What can we do about that? Or like, what don't we agree with this policy or this issue?
The United Nations is demanding Ethiopia allows international observers to parts of the country after a weekend of protests. They want to investigate allegations of excessive force used across Oromia and Amhara regions. At least 90 demonstrators were killed during a wave of anti-government protests. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says news from the region was extremely alarming.
Ethiopian athlete Feisa Lilesa, who came second in the just concluded Olympic Games men's marathon, has claimed his life is in danger. Lilesa clocked the 42-kilometer race with a hand gesture against his country's government. The gesture is popularly made by the Oromo people, who have been undergoing brutal police crackdowns.
It was just the expansion of Addis Ababa, like the master plan, quote unquote, that really sparked, I guess, the fuel or the fire or whatever that resulted in what we have today. Starting in Oromia, starting in the Oromo region, students, I mean, innocent people being imprisoned, tortured, held against their will, killed, protest after protest, really starting in that area, and then other parts of the region obviously having issues with what's been going on with the government and the regime that was in power, a minority that was taking basically most of the economic privileges away from the country and from the people. And that eventually resulted into what we have today, which is, I mean, there wasn't an election. It's not like the parties changed. There's a new chairman of the EPRDF, right, which is Dr. Abiy Ahmad, who became the prime minister, and who came with a completely different point of view, thought process. Like, I even remember, like, one of his first speeches where he was talking about his mom, or he talks about mental health, things that, you know, a leader of a country, especially in sub-Saharan Africa or in, you know, that part of the world, is just unheard of. So he was a fresh breath air, really, for the people. But he had been around the whole time. I think sometimes people forget that.
And it was to the point where the youth realized lives would have to be lost for this to happen. To get not even domestic attention, but international attention, people are going to have to lose their lives. And these protests had thousands of people coming together without any single person knowing if this was their last day, right? And then it started, like she said, in the Oromo region, and then it trickled throughout the whole country. And then Amhara took notice, I think, in summer of 2016. And then it got to the point where members of parliament in EPRDF wondered, could this regime last throughout this protest? Because it was very big. And the power of social media came across the entire world and diaspora, like all of us. Yeah, these movements.
Like,
and then
the bill that was passed in the States. Anyways,
and then not even by definition, but political activists started coming out of their bedrooms as Ethiopians and basically enabling people from within the nation through their Facebook lives or through their Twitter, through their tweets. So it enabled the people of Ethiopia to realize that the world is watching and their people are paying attention to the possible reform that could happen. So that just ignited a light, and it shot through the entire nation to the point where Abiy came into power as the ideal man.
I don't believe the political sphere is free for the opposition parties. So from that perspective, I think it's very difficult to label this election as free and fair.
EPRDF is Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and it's something that the TPLF enacted to basically divide and conquer. So in a sense, it's represented by all of Ethiopia, quote unquote. So you have the Oromo Party, the Amhara Democratic National Front, or something like along those lines, and then you have the southern people of Ethiopia, and then you have the Tigray People's Liberation Front.
And their way of kind of addressing these regional ethnic issues and divisions and lines was to create this front of this national front, whereby there was representation from the various areas. However, that wasn't actually what went down. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like a front to like what actually was going down, and the fact that the TPLF as a minority was actually getting the majority. The regions of Ethiopia changed after 91. So the provinces and regions became ethnically based.
Right.
And when you draw new lines, obviously there are issues. We were talking about Badame and the issues there. And within the country, even till today, there are issues that people have still not been able to work out amongst themselves, amongst the regions, amongst the federal government. And so that lies a huge issue for the nation. And again, that was perpetuated by that regime.
The war separated me and my family. Now I am in Eritrea and they are in Ethiopia. So I don't know when I'm going to see them again.
Families split either side of the Ethiopian-Eritrean border have been finally able to speak to each other for the first time in decades. This was on Monday after direct telephone communications were restored.
The landmark move cementing the reconciliation between the once bitter enemies. On Tuesday, emotional reunion scenes erupted between people on both sides of the border, 2 decades after they were separated by a bloody war.
Why it's happening now, I think it's because there was the nomination of a new prime minister in April in Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmad. That really was the game changer. He made a lot of announcements, for example, the release of political prisoners and the fact that he wanted to make peace with Eritrea. And the other important note is that Ethiopia had been governed for nearly 30 years by my ethnic minority, which were the Tigrayans, and they had become the enemies of Eritrea. Whereas Abiy Ahmed, he's an Oromo from the major ethnic group in Ethiopia, and this also facilitated discussions.
We, Ethiopian and Eritrean people, we have
we are one, or we have a common kinship. So today we are happy.
I think we have a really great momentum going, and I think it's really important that, you know, we talked about hope, and I think I hope that the government like maximizes on the people's hope and like uses it constructively, because I think that it can be a very powerful source. And there is a lot of youth that are still in the country that do want to see the growth of the country. So I hope that there's a way that people's dreams that they've been kind of sitting on, that they've had to sit on for so long, are able to be actualized. And I hope that the government gives more space to people to be open and be happy again, because the way that they were outpouring for when the Prime Minister came to the country, like that's telling of what has been kind of suppressed for a very long time. It's kind of been like dark days. So I hope that the government is able to kind of reinstill that camaraderie that is what got us through the 30-year war, and that togetherness that I think the country really needs.
2 years ago, would we have thought that this would have happened, you think?
With
no, you don't know what's gonna happen. No. I'm not gonna say this. I'm not gonna say you think this. You didn't think this is gonna happen, but you knew the TPLF was kind of like on their way out.
I just knew it was getting bubbly. I never thought that there would be a time where they'd be out, like they'd have to leave. Members of parliament within the EPRDF would start saying, "I don't think this could work."
Like standing up and saying.
And then when the Prime Minister resigned, I was like, okay, we could see some movement here,
sure.
But at the rate of growth that is happening is unbelievable.
And even within Eritrea too, like I'm saying within the two countries, that in itself too, you know, the way it all went down. Like it wasn't just within Ethiopia, it was Eritrea, it was Somalia, it was like
last summer I'm riding
trickling.
I'm riding through Addis Ababa, and then when the first delegation of Eritrean diplomats came to Ethiopia, right, the entire city had one Ethiopian flag and one Eritrean flag on every goalpost. Wow. I had to stop my car to double take, get out, and realize I'm like, is there an Eritrean?
Never would have thought that. The US, the EU, and the UK, like they definitely need to stop playing games when it comes to African foreign policy. I think when the border issue was going on, I felt like because they were friends with Ethiopia, they just allowed them to just occupy the illegal territory. Eritrea responds by keeping the conscription and like having everyone there, the military there. What happens is the Eritrean refugee crisis occurs, and what happens is the Europeans end up dealing with our problems. You know, countries like Germany, Sweden, Italy, there's so many refugees coming in, and I've seen it. They don't like it. I've been there. They don't like it in those countries. But that was a result of them just sitting back watching what happens. So you can see where sometimes it bites them from behind when they just sit back and let these things happen, because by them doing that, now they have a refugee crisis in Europe that they're crying about. But it could have been prevented had they just told the Ethiopians, been fair, been like, hey, you guys can't do this and that. I hope they learn from that, and that they deal with the situation, they take it seriously instead of just letting like certain things happen that could have a bad effect on everybody.
I really hope that as we move forward, there's more of an active role that diaspora plays in like helping build up the country, because I feel like that's the thing that I can't get out of my mind is, oh my gosh, like my cousins, my relatives that are all there, that this country is being built on their backs, and I have this privilege of like having these resources, having education. So like, what can I do now? How do we ally with each other to build the country up and build up the economy so that we can become, a Wakanda? Like, how do we get there?
I agree with everything you're saying. Yeah, like I would love to see us celebrating our similarities and understanding our differences. And yes, like it goes back, honestly, like colonial powers at the end of the day shaped Africa and shaped our countries, and had a huge role in that. And we share languages, we share cultures, we share people, we share food and all of that great stuff. But at the same time, you're right, they're two completely different nations in their makeup and everything. So there are differences within the nation, within the region, within the countries, etc. But my point is, economically and politically, what's going to work for that nation, for Eritrea, may not work for Ethiopia. I mean, the same things. You know what I mean? Looking at 5 million, 6 million people compared to 100 million. like we can bond and we can love each other for all these similarities and all these great things, and then also understand that we are different, that we're two different nations, and that we need different things. But at the end of the day, we all want health, we all want education, we all want freedom, we all want love, we all want people to walk down the street and have hope, dream, you know, of something greater than them, and be able to attain that, and to use each other as nations, as friends, as family, to better each other and to better our future together.
I think you guys summed it up all perfectly. Just as human beings, we all kind of want the same things, and we have a lot of similarities between us. And yeah, man, I'm hopeful for the future and us working together.
Like, yes, the peace treaty is made, and we've already grown so much together as nations in the past couple months, but that's just the first step, and there's a lot more steps to be taken to be sufficient with each other's best interests in mind. And in Ethiopia's case, for the past, since '91, it's been a self-proclaimed democracy, but a democracy is, someone put it like this, he said a democracy is not an adjective, it's not something you can describe, it's a verb. You have to take action with it. And for the past 27, 28 years, there hasn't been many democratic action taken within our nation. So now that we have the platform to do that, alongside such a beneficiary as good as Eritrea, knowing that we have history together, opportunities are endless for the both of us.
No, I think
said what I said. Like, I ain't gonna hold back.
No, but you know what it is? Oh
like,
my
I'm not afraid.
Like, you can't say, oh, everybody else is a knucklehead and I don't know, maybe that's me policing, but I feel like that's not the kind of claims you want in a video you're putting out. You'd be like, everybody's dumb and I'm the one that knows.
Right. I understand.
But that's how you gonna get views.
But that's not like, I know you're saying because I do get like that sometimes. It's just that, like, it's just my. You gonna tell me that these older Habeshas aren't hard-headed?
Of course. Imagine some of the things that they've seen.
But even my grandfather was hard. Like, he would have been like that before the war.
No,
it's
but then it's also
in the DNA.
It's also a mixture.
Yeah.
No, my God! Oh my God!
That's how we are.
No. Wait, no.
My dad.
Off the record.
My God.
Off the record.